Hey guys, welcome back to Coach Hall Writes. Today's video is an updated version of how to pass the AP Lang exam. Sometimes students are a little bit confused about what information they actually receive from the College Board when exam scores are released. So what you're going to receive is called your composite score. This is a score between 1 and 5, 1 being the lowest, 5 being the highest. This is also what you would send to a college. Unfortunately, you don't get to find out exactly how many multiple choice questions you answered correctly, nor do you get to find out your individual essay scores. Instead, all of this is factored together, and then you get a composite score. So let's talk about the exam itself. 45% of your composite score comes from your multiple choice. Now for the AP Lang exam, there are now 45 questions, which leads us to say that essentially each question is worth 1 point. The other 55% of your score is the 3 essays. Now each essay is scored on a 6-point rubric. Before we get started talking about how to do well on the exam, I want to give a quick disclaimer, and that is that this video is intended to be more of an overview, just to kind of review those major concepts to help set you up for success. But I do have other videos on this channel that go much more in depth into a lot of different topics, and so I would love it if you would go check out those videos as well. Also, I'm not affiliated with the College Board. I'm just an AP Lang teacher, so these tips are based on what has worked for my students and what I've seen work in the past. One of the reasons that students take AP classes is because of the potential for college credit. So we talked a little bit about composite scores, but oftentimes students want to know which score they need to get in order to earn college credit. And quite frankly, this depends on the college itself. Each college or university is able to set their own standards. That being said, most colleges require at least a 3 composite. There are some colleges that might require a 4 or even a 5. So you want to look at the college's website to figure out what they will accept as far as a score and also what it will count as in terms of college credit. In previous years, the AP Lang multiple choice was based on reading passages. However, the exam was recently redesigned and now there are both reading and writing passages. So let's talk about the reading passages. There are going to be 2 reading passages. It's going to be a nonfiction passage. They're going to give you what information you need to know about the passage in order for it to make sense. This is usually included above the passage in italics. The reading passages tend to be a little bit longer and tend to have more questions than the writing passages. And for these, they're looking for reading comprehension. So there's going to be questions about purpose and word choice, things like that. Now, you don't really need to memorize a list of terms for this. However, there is something called a CED or course exam description, and that gives you some sample questions and it goes over some terminology, things like exigence or concession. It also talks about things like purpose, tone, line of reasoning. So there are certain words that you've probably heard in your class that you need to be familiar with, but I don't think there's a list of words that you truly need to memorize. For previous years, it used to be that sometimes they would include the names of different types of devices in the answer choices, and that could be a bit confusing to students, which is why there are some lists out there of words to know. However, they seem to be going away from that type of question. Unlike the SAT and ACT, which have 4 answer choices, the AP Lang exam has 5 answer choices. And so a couple of the answers hopefully are going to be really obvious as ones that you can eliminate, but sometimes students narrow it down to 2 that seem really good and they have to choose. So use the process of elimination. If part of the answer doesn't make sense, it doesn't fit the passage, then that answer is wrong. Also look very carefully at the wording of each answer choice. Because you have to answer 45 questions in 1 hour, you don't want to linger too long on any one question because quite frankly, all the questions are weighted the same. And sometimes students linger over one question and then it eats away time that they could be spending answering other questions that they would get right. So don't linger too long on any one question. Also, it probably goes without saying, but make sure that you read the question and the answer choices carefully. Sometimes there's words in all caps. Other times, the answer choices might only be slightly different, so you want to make sure that you are reading carefully so as to avoid a clumsy or obvious mistake. You also want to answer each question. There's no penalty for guessing. The writing questions are new this year in 2021. They were actually supposed to debut last year. However, the College Board did an abbreviated exam because of the pandemic. So for these passages, they tend to be a bit shorter and they tend to have fewer questions. So there's actually going to be 3 writing passages. And instead of focusing on comprehension, these passages actually focus on your understanding of style. So you actually are acting like an editor in these. You're trying to combine sentences and choose effective transitions. You're determining if there should be a sentence that is added or deleted, things like that. Students often want to know how many questions they need to answer correctly in order to achieve a certain composite score. Now, you have to remember that the essays are also a factor here. However, I generally recommend that students aim for at least 55 to 60% correct on their multiple choice. Now, for some students, this is a little bit more of a struggle. For others, this is very easily attainable. However, a little bit more than 50% seems doable because students are not expected to make 100 on these multiple choice tests. So keep in mind that everybody has different strengths, but generally speaking, to be on track for a 3, I recommend about 55 to 60% correct on multiple choice and also about a 4 out of 6 on the essays. Now, obviously, the higher you score on the multiple choice and or the essays, that puts you in contention for a 4 or even a 5 composite. As you are preparing for the exam and you're practicing the multiple choice questions, try to determine which questions are your strengths and which ones are your weaknesses. So for some students, they might be stronger at the writing questions as opposed to the reading questions. And also within those categories, you might have certain strengths. Like for instance, you might be really good at the ones that have transition words, but you might not be as good at the add delete questions. So once you know which ones you struggle with, that can help you know how to study, and you can also focus on different tips and tricks for that type of question. The essays make up 55% of your composite score. And for the essays, you're given a 15-minute reading period, and they recommend 40 minutes per essay. So we're going to talk about how to pace for that a little bit later on in this video. But as far as what score you need for the essays, I personally recommend that students aim for a 4 out of 6 or higher. And that's because if you look at the wording for the different rubrics, there's a distinct shift, in my opinion, between a 2 out of 4 in row B and a 3 out of 4 in row B. So row B is evidence and commentary, and based on the wording, it seems like students who can earn at least a 3 out of 4 in row B tend to be on track for demonstrating the skills necessary for the particular task. So really look at the rubrics and make sure you understand what the rubrics ask for, and also look at those released student samples to make sure you understand not just what the rubric says, but what it means in execution. Students often want to know what they can do to earn that sophistication point because it is incredibly hard to earn. Now, I have done 2 separate videos on this, one for synthesis and one for rhetorical analysis. However, in general, I advise my own students to not focus too much on the sophistication point. Now, we do look at essays that did earn the point, and we do talk about why that essay earned the point and how they could perhaps mimic that technique in their writing. And even if the student doesn't end up writing an essay that earns the sophistication point, I've found that it does tend to help their commentary. So it can be good to know what leads to sophistication, but I personally wouldn't stress out about it too much, especially if you're still trying to figure out how to comfortably write a 4 out of 6. The synthesis essay, or question 1, is kind of like a mini research paper. So you're going to be provided with anywhere from 6 to 8 sources, at least one of which will be a visual text. So this could be a chart, a photograph, a cartoon, things like that. And you have to develop a position on the topic. So it's really important that you actually read the prompt carefully and figure out what exactly you're supposed to assert a position on. Because I have seen a few essays where students sort of misinterpreted the prompt because they weren't reading closely enough. You also need to make sure that you cite 3 or more sources. Now, there is no bonus for citing all of the sources, so you want to cite at least 3. I usually recommend that my students cite 4 just in case. And also you need to remember that it's distinct sources. So let's say that you cite source A 2 separate times. That doesn't count as 2 sources. That's just 2 citations. So the sources are lettered and you need to cite 3 different sources. I actually have my students write the letter of the sources at the top margin of their page when they're doing in-class essays because it helps them keep track of which sources they cited on each page, and then they can go back and just double check that they have 3 distinct sources. Now, I don't know if students actually do this on the exam or not, but there is a benefit to just double checking that you've clearly cited 3 different sources. Technically speaking, students can cite the source by saying, according to source A, and then embedding their evidence. However, that's not necessarily the most sophisticated way to do it, and sometimes it doesn't necessarily flow very well. So as you're preparing for the exam, try to learn how to do something called parenthetical citations. You use these in MLA and APA format, and basically what it means is you embed evidence into a sentence of your own, and then at the end of the sentence, you put the source in parentheses, and the period goes outside the parentheses. That way you've still cited it, but it doesn't clutter up the sentence. It's also important to remember that a synthesis essay is not a summary of the sources. That's not the task. The task is to create your own argument and to use evidence from different sources to prove your argument. So while you do need to reference the different sources, your job is not to summarize them. I tell my students all the time to try to put the sources into conversation with each other, but I realize that not everybody understands what that means. So basically, the idea is that you want to create layers of evidence and commentary in your paragraphs. And oftentimes, though not always, this means citing two different sources in your paragraph. So you're going to be looking for sources that are similar or even different in a meaningful way. So basically, two different sources that help prove the main idea of your paragraph. That way, you're integrating different sources and they're starting to create a conversation as opposed to just relying on a single source for each main idea. Students sometimes struggle with commentary for their synthesis essays, and so these verbs that I've listed here on this slide are a good way to incorporate some commentary. Now, they're not exclusive to the synthesis essay. You can use these verbs in other essays too, but if you're ever struggling with how to develop your commentary, ask yourself what the evidence illustrates or suggests. You can also try to situate the issue in a broader context. So you could ask yourself if you have any relevant outside knowledge about the topic or personal experience with the topic. Would that help develop your argument? Also, you can kind of zoom out a little bit. So ask yourself why the issue is important to society. And also perhaps ask yourself how this issue will impact society in the future. Now that can be included in your body paragraphs or perhaps the conclusion paragraph if you're able to write one. And I say if you're able to write one because not all students are able to write a conclusion paragraph because of the time constraints, and your essay is viewed as a rough draft. So if you know you're not going to be able to write a conclusion, then incorporate that as commentary into your body paragraphs. In order to develop your argument, you might also include a counterclaim and rebuttal or a concession and refutation. Now, I do have a concession and refutation video on my channel. You want to make sure that you have enough time to do this and to do it correctly because you really do want to develop this. It's not necessarily just a single sentence. And oftentimes students try it, but it doesn't necessarily benefit their argument. So you really want to make sure that it's adding some meaning to your essay. And also remember that these come in pairs. So you do want to acknowledge the opposing side, but you also want to refute it to continue to prove your claim. So a lot of students save this for like a third body paragraph just in case they run out of time. So this is something to practice. It's not mandatory, but it can help. Question 2 is rhetorical analysis. This one is my personal favorite essay, and just as a really quick, shameless plug, I am working on an ebook that will be ready before the 2021 AP Lang exam, all about mastering rhetorical analysis. So if you want to be the first to know when that comes out, I will leave a link to it in the description box below. All right, so now let's talk about the essay itself. I do have several videos about rhetorical analysis on my channel. The most important thing I think that students need to realize is that they need to analyze a rhetorical choice thoroughly. Now, I'll admit, when I saw that on the rubric, once it was redesigned, I was like, oh, that's not that hard. But the problem is, I think sometimes students don't really know how deeply they're supposed to analyze, or they just run out of things to say. So we need to understand what a rhetorical choice is. It's something that the writer actively does. So we want to try to use active verbs for this. Also, we want to connect it to the rhetorical situation. So I use the acronym SPACE-CAT in my class. So the space part of SPACE-CAT. So speaker, purpose, audience, context, exigence, and also message or argument is the rhetorical situation. So I have some different ways that students can connect to this. I use sentence frames and stuff that I have included both in my ebook and some other videos. But that's a way to develop your commentary because you want to ask yourself, why is the writer making this choice for this audience on this occasion? We really want to dig into the why for your analysis. Based on the stable wording of the exam questions, you're going to see one of three phrases: convey a message, achieve a purpose, or develop an argument. Now, it really kind of depends on the passage itself, which of these phrases that they use. However, you want to make sure that you are answering the prompt. There's this old joke that AP stands for answer the prompt. Obviously, it doesn't, but it's still a valid reminder because you want to make sure that you're actually addressing what you're being asked to address. So if you're being asked to address a message, that doesn't mean that you don't examine purpose, but you really want to highlight what the message actually is and how the speaker is making choices to convey that message. So don't lose sight of the prompt just because you've seen that phrasing before. Question 3 is the argument essay. This one is relatively similar to a synthesis essay in terms of how you might construct the argument. The big difference is that you're not given any sources. Instead, you're given a quote. You don't actually need to rewrite the quote or reference the quote. It just kind of gives you a little bit of context for the issue that you're going to be writing about. But it's really important that you actually assert a position here, and you need to use specific evidence. That's going to be the make it or break it thing for most students in their essay. So what happens is, if students use generalizations or hypotheticals, that's going to lower their evidence and commentary score. If students have somewhat specific evidence, they're still not going to earn that 3 or 4 in row B. So you need specific evidence. And so I would recommend looking at some of the released samples, specifically from 2019 and 2018, that have been rescored with this new 6-point rubric, just to determine what the College Board considers specific evidence. Because a lot of times when students write essays, they know what they're talking about, but the reader can't infer. And so some of it gets lost in translation. There's little gaps of context that are missing, or the evidence is just kind of vague in general, and we really need those specifics. So that would be my biggest tip, is understand what they mean by specific evidence. I've mentioned layers of evidence and commentary previously in this video, and it applies to question 3 as well. Now, this is just a tip because I have seen some essays that have like a 1-layer paragraph that's very developed, and it still does well. But if you look at some of the higher scoring samples, you'll notice that the student pairs 2 related examples within the same paragraph. So they have a topic sentence, evidence, commentary, and a concluding sentence. And so when you put those pieces of evidence into conversation with each other, it helps prove your point even more. In my classroom, I use the acronym CHORES, which stands for Current Events, History, Outside Knowledge, Reading, Experiences, and Science, to help students remember some of the different types of evidence that they can include. Now, you're not expected to be strong in all of these categories. And yes, you can write about personal experience. I recently posted a video on the channel talking about how to write about personal experience effectively. Not everybody's going to be strong in scientific knowledge or history, but hopefully you have some personal experience that you could use, or outside knowledge. That can be really interesting. So let's say you're really into sports or music. Depending on the prompt, you can actually incorporate that knowledge as well. So stick to your wheelhouse as best as possible. A lot of times students try to use examples that are sort of overdone. So for instance, they might talk about Columbus or Rosa Parks, and honestly, they don't write about it very effectively because they only know general information. So instead, try to play to your strengths. And you might be wondering, okay, well, how do I get better at this? One tip I have for you to do is to start listening to podcasts and or TED Talks. Choose a couple people that you might want to learn more about, presumably people who have somehow led to some kind of social change or who maybe have experienced some kind of adversity. Just learn a little bit more about their life story. Also, maybe listen to a couple podcasts or TED Talks that deal with some kind of like social change, maybe a movement of some sort or a war, because these might be different types of examples that would relate to multiple types of prompts. So you can study, so to speak, for the exam just by broadening your knowledge base, but you're not expected to know everything. So just really focus on stuff that interests you that can make your essay a little bit more unique. Let's talk about pacing and timing, because if we're being honest, 40 minutes is not very long to write an essay. That's why it's considered a rough draft. But even so, with all the pressure of exam day, 40 minutes can go by really quickly. So I would recommend having some sort of game plan going in. So some students are stronger in one type of essay over another. So they might know that if they spend a little bit more time on that essay and a little bit less time on a different type of essay, they could potentially improve their score on their stronger essay. Whereas if they spent more time on the weaker essay, the score might not change. Now, that doesn't apply to everybody, but knowing your strengths and weaknesses can help influence your game plan. Going with this idea of playing to your strengths, sometimes students like to spend either more or less than 40 minutes per essay. So I broke down the times for you here on the left. Everybody gets a 15-minute reading period and then the recommended 40 minutes per essay. If you're taking the test in person, they're just going to cue you and say, your 40 minutes has passed. We recommend moving on to the next essay. It's some sort of scripted response. That being said, it's not mandatory that you move on. You get to work at your own pace. So sometimes students like to kind of come up with their own timeline. So I made a sample of one that has worked for a lot of my students in the past, and I've included it here on the right. Now, I'm not saying this is the best way or the only way. I really think it depends on the person. Also, if you're taking the digital exam, please keep the different rules for that in mind because there are some differences with the digital format as opposed to the paper format. Given the time constraints, there are some ways that you can save time. So one way to do this is to write a quick introduction. So I recommend that students try to write a sentence or two of context and then their defensible thesis. Now, sometimes students don't really have time or they can't think of what to say before their thesis, so they just write a thesis. And technically speaking, for the exam, that's okay. I like a sentence or two in front of it if possible because I think it flows better, but you get a point for your defensible thesis. I recommend getting that out of the way because then you know what you're arguing and then your reader knows what you're arguing. So don't waste time on these long-winded introductions because you're just taking up time and you're taking up page space. Get to the point with your intro and then move on to the body paragraphs. That's where you truly need to develop your ideas. It's also worth mentioning that conclusions are not mandatory based on the rubric. So can they be helpful? Yes. Sometimes students are able to use the conclusion to situate the issue in a broader context or to just successfully round out their essay. Other times, though, students just restate everything they've already said and it's like one sentence. And sometimes those seem a little bit redundant. So I think you need to use your best judgment based on what you've already written at that point. If you would do better by spending more time on your body paragraphs because that would help your score, that's what I would recommend. But if you think you can write a quick conclusion that would help round out your essay in like 2 to 5 minutes, then do that. I don't think conclusions are imperative, but I do think there are times when they help an essay. But at the same time, I also kind of secretly hate it when students just write like a 1-sentence conclusion that's like literally just their thesis because then it kind of falls flat. Personal pet peeve, doesn't affect the score, but end with a strong note. For exam purposes, one way to save time is to be a bit more systematic with how you approach the synthesis essay. So because there are 6 to 8 sources and you only need to cite 3 of them, I would recommend that if you know you're not going to use a source, or if you know you don't genuinely understand the source, don't keep reading it and don't keep annotating it. Move on, because that way you can look for other sources that better fit your argument. Something else to consider is don't just dismiss a source simply because it's long. In fact, a lot of times the longer sources have really good information in them. So it's important that you read through these quickly. You're not reading for entertainment, you're reading for information. So some students are able to speed read, and you need to kind of practice this, but basically the idea is, in a lot of cases anyway, that you don't read every single word, you just pull out the important points. Another way to do this would be to look at the first couple paragraphs and then look at the topic and concluding sentences of the remaining paragraphs and then read that last paragraph. So you're cutting down on the amount that you're reading, but you're still pulling out the main ideas because those are usually found in the topic and concluding sentences of a paragraph. So be systematic with this, but I would truly recommend to practice this in advance. Don't just try to pull this skill out on exam day. Practice this in advance. It may seem counterintuitive, but one way to save time is to actually reserve a little bit of time to plan your essay. And the reason why is because a lot of times when students don't have a plan and they just try to wing it, then they get a portion of the way done with the essay and they get writer's block. They don't know what to say next. They have to reread what they've already written and they lose focus. So having a plan can help you write more quickly because you know what you want to say. Also, if time's running out, you could look at your outline and figure out exactly what you need to include in order to get the score that you're looking for. So have a quick outline, make sure that it's not super detailed, but detailed enough that you know what you're supposed to do. Another reason that outlines help is because I've actually seen essays where students have written multiple sentences, sometimes even a whole paragraph, and then they've crossed it out. And if you cross it out, your AP reader is not going to read it. So don't waste a ton of time trying to scratch stuff out so no one can ever see it. If you draw a line through it, your reader is not going to read it. And a lot of times when students do this, they've wasted time. And even if the rewrite is better, they've still wasted time and their essay is shorter and oftentimes less developed. So if you have an outline, you're less likely to stray from your thesis and you're more likely to actually stay focused and on task. Another way to save time is to turn off your internal editor. And what I mean by that is I've seen students kind of like stall as they're writing because they're searching for the perfect word or phrase. And instead of actually just putting words on the page, they wait and they have a little bit of writer's block. And so what I would recommend doing in those instances is remember that you are not trying to write an award-winning novel here. You are writing a rough draft of an essay. So get the words on the page, finish the essay, and then if there's time, go back and polish up your writing. But if you stall because you can't think of the right word or phrase, it could be detrimental to your pacing overall. If you do go back and proofread your essay, don't worry so much about the grammatical mistakes. That's not going to impact your score, but it can be helpful to add notes in the margin or even put a little asterisk and then put an asterisk at the end of your essay and kind of match those up. If you need to add content, more commentary perhaps, or a sentence or two to clarify what you've written, those are the meaningful additions to your essay, as opposed to just making sure that your grammar is good. While it's nice to read an essay that has proper comma usage and things like that, it's really about the content. So if you do have time to proofread, focus on improving your content. Make sure that you're using specifics and make sure that it's clear. Don't forget to check out the description box below if you're interested in finding out more information about my rhetorical analysis ebook. It's going to be student friendly, so it's great for teachers and students. Also, if you're on TikTok, don't forget to check out Coach Hall Writes because I post content over there as well. Until next time, guys, happy writing!